Hello, my dear friends. Thank you once again for coming to hear another installment of Civil Defense. I'm going to do some short versions of Civil Defense, which will actually make them more accessible to many people who can't spend the half an hour uh, trying to decipher some of the scientific jargon that the book we are reading from is full of. Um, but what I'm trying to do is to follow this book because it does have useful information, and at some point I'm going to summarize most of it into some kind of practical form that we can perhaps put into practice. Uh, Recently, we've been going over uh, basically the effects of the atomic bomb on the physical body uh, and the different organs and organ systems that are affected by especially radiation from the bomb. We know there are many effects of the bomb. There's the shock wave, there's the heat blast, there's of course the incredible destructive force that tears down buildings, um, many different effects. And one of them, of course, is the radiation itself, which the bomb has been famous for. We know that there are intense gamma rays, which are like very strong X rays that emanate from the bomb. And if you're too close, you will basically be killed by these high intensity uh, electromagnetic waves. Um, so, that's one form. There are other forms of radiation, neutrons flying all over the place, uh, high speed electrons called beta particles. There's a lot to deal with and contend with, a lot to figure out how one can protect oneself from a nuclear blast if it should happen. And we are getting the feeling that uh, it is more possible today than it has been for many, many years. Perhaps since the bomb was first dropped on two cities in Japan. So, what we've been doing recently is going over this part of the book entitled The Effects of the Atomic Bomb, which was basically issued by the government in a revised edition in 1950, and we'll continue to read from that. Like I said, this is going to be an attenuated broadcast because basically we've not been able to go live on Facebook. This is being recorded on my channel on YouTube, but I will be posting it on Facebook. So let's go on to the next set of organs that are affected by radiation. Um, Reproductive organs. Almost every post-mortem examination of males dying from radiation sickness revealed profound changes in the testes. Even as early as the 14th day after exposure, when gross changes were not apparent, microscopic observation showed remarkable alteration in the layers of the epithelium from which the spermatozoa develop. Many of the cells were degenerated, and evidence of healthy cell division was lacking. Some of the blood vessels of the testes presented the most marked radiation changes of any vessels in the body. Changes in the ovaries were less striking than in the testes. Except for hemorrhages, as part of the general tendency to bleed, no gross changes were observed. Neither were there any striking microscopic changes. In many instances, the ova were not developing normally after exposure, and this induced alterations in the menstrual cycle. Cessation of menstruation occurred, but it was transient. There was also an increased incidence of miscarriages and premature births, and an increased death rate among expectant mothers. In general, these manifestations varied in severity according to the proximity of the individual to the explosion. In connection with changes in the reproductive organs, it may be noted that the total body dose of radiation required to sterilize a man is believed to be from 400 to 600 Roentgens, which would be lethal in most cases. Temporary sterility can occur with smaller doses, however, as happened among Japanese men and women, and the vast majority of these have since returned to normal. It cannot be stated that all have recovered because it is not known how many were sterile from other causes, such as disease and malnutrition, before the bombings. But many afflicted with radiation sickness have since produced normal children. So what's interesting about this is that we are sort of led to believe that any radiation that we suffer is like the worst thing that could ever happen. Everybody will die out from the fallout, et cetera, et cetera. I think the effects of radiation are often exaggerated. It doesn't mean that the effects can be harmful, and we haven't really examined all of the effects as of yet, even those mentioned in this book. Genetic effects are to come. But this idea that radiation, even the slightest amount, is going to really hurt someone, remember that we had cosmic radiation always bombarding us, this background radiation that always exists. And of course, there's radon, which collects in the basements of homes, and that's an extremely radioactive gas. There are many other sources of radiation that we experience every day. So, of course, after an atomic bomb, the levels of radiation are much higher than the background radiation. But even still, what this seems to be saying is that, even though someone has been exposed to radiation enough to temporarily sterilize them, they can recover from that. So let's look into one more portion here. Because of the great penetrating power of the high energy gamma rays, evidence of the effect of radiation on the skin of Japanese casualties was not definite. Epilation, in other words, loss of hair, was common, mainly on the scalp, among those who survived for more than 2 weeks after the explosion. The time of onset of epilation reached a sharp peak for both males and females between the 13th and 14th day. The hair suddenly began to fall out in bunches upon combing or general plucking, and much fell out spontaneously. This continued for 1 or 2 weeks and then ceased. In most instances, the distribution was that of ordinary baldness, involving first the front and then the top and back of the head. The hair of the eyebrows, and particularly the eyelashes and beard, came out much less easily. Excuse me. In a small group, which may or may not have been typical, 69% had lost hair from the scalp, 12% from the armpits, 10% from pubic areas, 6% from the eyebrows, and 3% from the beard. Even in severe cases, hair began to return within a few months. In no instance was the epilation permanent. Okay, so there we once again have it, kind of a survivability lesson that even under the circumstances of intense exposure to the effects of an atomic bomb, people do have a tendency to recover. In subsequent readings, we will go over still more. We will go over still more effects. I think we'll read one more passage here on on the effect on the gastrointestinal tract. The mucous linings of the gastrointestinal tract were among the first tissues to show gross changes. Even before hemorrhages and associated phenomena were noticed, there was swelling, greenish and yellowish gray discoloration, and thickening of the mucous membranes of the cilium and large intestine. That's the cecum and large intestine. Patches of lymphoid tissue were especially involved. At times, a diphtheria-like membrane covered the mucous lining, and sometimes tissue underneath were swollen and waterlogged. Subsequently, hemorrhages occurred into and under the linings of the stomach and intestine, initiating a series of changes similar to those occurring in the initial stages. There was first swelling, then ulceration of the most superficial layers of the mucous membranes lining the tract, proceeding to deeper ulceration and a membrane-like covering of the ulcer, suggesting but not entirely simulating that seen in bacillary dysentery. In the third and fourth weeks, inflammation of the intestines and occasionally of the stomach was a common post-mortem observation. In the small intestine, the early changes were often seen in the crypts of the folds of the mucous membrane, when the membranes appeared blanched. Later they became greenish or yellowish gray in color. In the later stages of this cycle, in those individuals who survived for longer periods of time, the large intestines had a more widespread involvement of everything from the lower end of the small intestines to the rectum. Thickening of the intestinal wall was a common feature. All these changes, including the tendency to produce false membranes, resembled those of acute bacillary dysentery. The effects depended upon the devitalization of tissues as a primary result of radiation, lowered local resistance, and lowered efficiency of the defense mechanisms ordinarily supplied in the circulating blood. Under the microscope, the notable changes were the swelling of cells and the absence of infiltration of the white blood cells. So that ends our reading for today. As I said, I'm trying to make these shorter, and hopefully I will find ways to make them better in terms of the content. I do think this is interesting content, even though it is kind of technical. It's content that you won't ordinarily be exposed to if you just read a popular version of the effects of nuclear explosions. So I'm going to end here. I'm sorry that I can't go on live on Facebook anymore, but it is not a major problem. I'm going to post this around 9 or 10 o'clock and I hope you will all see it, get a chance to watch it, and then be ready for the next installment, which will be tomorrow. So once again, this is Peter Duveen. This is the 28th of March, 2022, and I hope you all have a great evening and hope to see you tomorrow. Thank you.